Hi folks, really lovely to see you all again, and thanks, as I said a minute ago, for your patience and accommodating a week's gap. I really appreciate that. And it's our final session this evening, so we will do as usual. We'll have a presentation, fairly short, and then we'll open up discussion with Andrew, who's joining us this evening, and I'm sure David and Fergus will also want to be contributing too, because I think this evening is probably more about discussion than just kind of presentation, because we're going to be talking about managing in extremes. And we've definitely had some extremes in the last 12 months. It's been a very interesting time in terms of planning grazing. So it's probably going to be most useful to reflect back on the last 12 months and what we all did and what action we took and how that worked. I'm just going to mute David because there was a bit of chat in the background. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and I'm on an unknown connection with my internet. So I might just turn my video off so that we don't have any problems. Oh, right. Hopefully you can see the presentation there. So let me just stop my video. Cool. So this evening we're going to be looking at and thinking about managing in extremes, and how hopefully over the last 4 sessions we've kind of taken away that adaptive farm systems are the thing that's going to create that resilience as we go forward. We're going to have more varied climate, we're going to have more extreme weather patterns, so we have to find ways of being able to manage those, and particular management approaches and planning can help us to be more adaptive whilst maintaining system efficiency. And I think we've debated before the role of a grazing plan, and I know that there are some on this call who are quite confident to not plan or not have anything written down. And I definitely do like having things written down just because it helps me kind of stay right with what I'm doing. But it also can help when you're planning kind of emergency grazing adaptations, to be able to really see that grass wedge ahead of you. And I think particularly, if you've been doing this for years, then I definitely would say that the planning eases off. You can hold it in your head better. But if you're just starting this, then it can be really helpful to write things down. So this was back before Christmas. We always get a lot of snow here. Majority of the conversation, I think, this evening is probably going to be focused on drought, but I will touch on winter weather as well, just because it may be of interest to you. Obviously, we get a heck of a lot more of that up here in terms of extreme snow and cold than you guys down south. So, there we go. Hang on, did that get? Yeah, it did go forward. So I think the thing that I want us to think about is soil armor. That's going to be the thing that really helps us to manage in extremes. We've talked about the kind of regenerative principles, if you like, of keeping the soil covered and keeping those living roots in the soil. And the more that we can create and maintain something above the ground, the better off we're going to be as we're dealing with extreme temperatures. Penn very helpfully did some fantastic conversions of some of these temperatures, because they were in Fahrenheit, which meant nothing to me. So luckily, Penn, in helping with some of the resources for this evening, has done those conversions for us. So we can see from the image here that just within a few feet of each other, either the different grazing approach or the ground armor, or the ground cover, the earth armor that's left behind, makes a significant difference to the ambient temperature. Of the ground. Now, it was really interesting last summer. Lots of folk on the Mob Grazing UK chat WhatsApp group were going out with their thermometers and taking different temperature readings on different ground like this. So here in this image, the ambient temperature, the temperature just in the atmosphere standing around, is 29.4 degrees. So it's pretty warm. It's a nice warm summer's day. And you can see here that the temperature difference between that taller grass, that longer grass, that cover, and the grazed area, which actually, in this instance, they'd fenced off the left-hand bit of grazing, and they'd enabled actually continuous grazing on the right-hand side. So it wasn't that it had just been grazed. There was actually, in this example, continuous grazing on the right, and the bit on the left had been shut off. And the continuous grazing, the temperature at the ground was 42.8. So it was significantly higher than the ambient temperature. And in the longer grass, the temperature was 25.5. So it was still pretty warm, but it was definitely cooler than the ambient temperature. And it was definitely at a temperature where life was more comfortable and able to function. So we can see here immediately that if we've got that hotter temperature down in that right-hand side, that grass is probably going to be less likely to grow. That soil is going to dry out. It's then going to crack, and then we're going to have this unintended kind of cycle of negative impacts of that decision to graze that down hard. Now, what I would say is that if you're holding animals up, so if you're thinking, oh God, we've got months of drought ahead of us and we're not going to have any rain, and I'm going to hold my animal back, and yes, you might be grazing much harder, and you might be buffering with hay or haylage, which a lot of folk were doing in the summer we've just had, and we'll come to that a bit later on. So sometimes it does make sense to graze it down a bit harder. But I think what's important here to understand is that if we can maintain those taller covers pre-drought, then we're going to have better likelihood that actually we can catch dew, we can keep those cooler temperatures. And again, you can see a similar picture here. So looking at air temperature of 31 degrees, so quite a lot, quite warm. It'd be a hot day. Well, particularly for those of us in Scotland, that's like, seriously tropical. But on the road, 47.8 degrees, so really, really hot on that tarmac, and not very much different from that on that short mown grass at the side of the road. The short mown grass and the tarmac are pretty similar. And I think that's really interesting. It just shows you, actually, you'd think that grass might be a bit cooler, but so much warmer. And then in that kind of bit at the side, immediately we've got a bit of shade, 22 degrees. And then out in the crop ground, 26, and then 30 a little bit further back. So actually, there is the air temperature above the crop ground, so that 30 degrees is the ambient temperature above the crop. So it's slightly cooler than the air temperature generally. But again, just showing that if we can maintain some ground cover, we can keep those temperatures down. And if we can keep that ground a little bit cooler, the plants have got more of a chance to grow because we're able to maintain moisture at the soil level. And not only is drought a challenge, but some of you may have experienced post-drought flash flooding. So we've thought about, okay, well, we're going to keep our ground cover, we're going to have that taller covers in normal conditions. And we've talked before about that connected porosity, that soil absorbs water like a sponge. And we know that in normal conditions with plenty of armor, nice green grass above the soil, that when it rains, the raindrops hit the plants, so they've got a bit of they've got something to disperse on, so they're not hitting into the soil, so they're coming down, hitting the plant, dispersing the energy, then getting to the soil, and then soaking away into the soil. Post drought conditions, if we haven't had that grass, or we've bitten it right down and it's burnt off, and the water starts hitting the soil, not only do we have that hard crust that's dried out and capped, so we talked about capping previously, the water then actually creates a worse capping, because as it's hitting the surface, it's doing even more capping damage to that soil, and it immediately runs off. So we've got that hard layer of soil, repels water post-drought. So even if we're then thinking, oh, thank goodness it's raining, actually we're not able to hold that water on farm, it's all disappearing. And it means that the plants then can't recover. So we're thinking, thank goodness it's raining, we've got all that rain, but no, we've not been able to hold that water, and the plants aren't able to utilize it. So it's not just about the management pre-grazing, we also have to think about, right, when it does eventually rain, which it always does because of where we are in a maritime climate, how do we best maintain the soil health so that we can actually make use of all of that water? And I just want to, this, guys, I'm sure we'll all be aware of, but these are high pressure systems and low pressure systems. When it's really hot and we have high pressure systems and we have soil that is bare and compacted, and the challenge that we have is that the rainfall is rejected. We get more flooding and drought, as we've just talked about. We get high temperatures at the soil level, and it means that our ground is just going to dry out, and the biology within the soil is less able to thrive. It's unable to cope. So we get those hot temperatures down at the soil. We have this persistent haze, and then we have that increased greenhouse effect, where we basically just continue to get hotter and hotter and hotter because we've got bare soil. Whereas if we have got that soil carbon sponge in place, we have got lots of green cover, we've also got, you know, healthy trees within that, we've got those functioning ecosystems, we're able to better cope with energy dispersal of rain when it does come down, and the rain is able to fall because of the heat that is able to escape, because we haven't got that persistent haze. We get those big convective clouds that you get before a storm, the really big towering clouds, so that when we do get those rapid release rainfall events, then we can make the most of soaking all that water in. So we always have to think not just about drought, what's happening now, but we know following drought we're likely to get heavy rainfall because of that convection, and so we have to think about how do we capture that rain when it does come. I feel like I'm flying through this, but I really did want this evening to be more about a discussion. So just to touch on, so we've thought about really hot weather, and we've thought about how we manage our grazing during that warmer weather. Cold weather, for example, we know that sheep and cattle, because they're ruminants, can thrive in temperatures easily down to -12. Our cattle quite happily comfortable in -20, as long as there's not a really, really strong wind. The rumen acts as a radiator, so we always feed late in the day to ensure they can stay warm overnight. So we tend to feed in the afternoon rather than in the morning when we've got really cold temperatures. And bale grazing is a really great way to manage winter feeding, and it can create a dry bed. And sometimes we'll roll out more bales than we need, because actually I'd rather that they've got hay as a dry bed and that they will also eat, and we're feeding the soil, rather than thinking about, right, how can I corral them or put them into a shed or something like that. So if you're going to be out wintering your animals, the most important thing is that they have to go into winter in good body condition. I want these animals fat as butter, fat as slugs, whatever terminology you want to use. But if you're going to outwinter, even, you know, in the sunny southeast of England, they must go into winter in good body condition. If they go in on the thin side, you're really going to struggle to maintain that kind of condition through the winter. And that will then lead to a compromised immune system, and, you know, they're more open to kind of picking up parasites, lice, etc., and having other health issues. So yeah, you want them going into winter on a good body condition. You can then feed a maintenance ration, so essentially, you know, feeding only as much hay as they really need, rather than ad lib and just giving them as much as they possibly could have, which can help you to better budget and can be more cost effective. And you can, you know, they might lose condition over the winter, but that's normal. We've kind of forgotten that is a normal way to kind of cope with colder weather, is that you should be a bit thin by March. And actually what that means is that they've got nice and fit, ready for calving or for lambing, if you're taking these systems with sheep. So as I said, cold weather, you know, similar thing. We want to have ground cover, not necessarily snow, but we want, you know, if we're bale grazing or we're on deferred grazing, I've talked before about having that really decent mat of permanent pasture, that longevity in the pasture underneath them to hold them up through that wetter or snow weather. And, you know, really thinking about planning ahead and thinking, right, in May, and I know I want to have my animals out in the winter, what are they going to be on? What's the pasture going to be like? What do I need to do now to plan? So always thinking way ahead, so that you don't suddenly end up in a rainy November thinking, oh God, everything's turning to mud, you know, what's happening here? I always find it interesting when farms talk about, oh, you know, we've had this weather problem or that weather problem, but actually, you know, you can kind of cope with most weathers if the more biomass that you have on the ground. So I think, yeah, that's the key thing that I really want, you know, folk to take away, that for drought or for snow or for rain, the key thing is about having plenty of sward on the ground to support your animals, both in terms of holding them up, creating feed, but also to cope with any rainfall. I think that's all. I know. And so just coming back to you know, we've shared this slide. I think I've shared this slide a couple of times before, but I cannot emphasize enough, as I keep saying, you know, that this adaptive grazing, where the majority of the time for any pasture it's resting, and then there's short pulses of grazing, and those might happen multiple times throughout the year, that's fine, but building that resting is the thing that's going to give you an active, healthy ecosystem, and it's functioning, healthy ecosystems that allow us to be resilient in extremes. You know, we really struggle to be resilient if we're always, you know, just coping or just managing or just enough grass. And I think the other thing that we haven't really talked about is the opportunity and potential to destock. And maybe that's something we'll talk about in a second in the discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm conscious that, you know, that the slides were sort of fairly basic and simple this evening, but I'm really up for kind of opening up the discussion a lot more. So Andrew, I don't know if you want to come in at this point, and if there's anything in terms of kind of ground temperatures that we were talking about, or some of the challenges that you've dealt with maybe over the last 12 months that have you know, you've had to think about changing your management and dealing with more extreme weather conditions.
Hi. Just to put you in the picture, really, I tended to, my grazing really, I'm a store finisher of both beef and sheep. So I haven't got any breeding animals. And I do tend to run them as a flood. So I will run cattle and sheep together just for ease of moving fences. And so there's less fences to move, etc. And I am mostly finishing livestock on overwinter cover crops in an arable situation. So I've got a limited amount of permanent pasture, and hence really not really the space to have breeding stock. We do, or I do, where I can, is to my permanent pasture tends to be either steep banks or marshland. So we are trying to we do rotationally graze that where we can. It's not easy with ditches and dikes, but we have done it, and it does work really well. Obviously, with the marshland, we don't have too much problem in the summer with drought down there. But obviously, on the in some of the arable situations, we're farming on chalk, and drought has been an issue. But and again, where we are grazing cover crops, I'm trying to leave quite a lot of residue behind, which is obviously having the effect of enabling me to keep my biology working, having the residual cover, and obviously, deflecting sunlight and insulating soil, really. So seeing all of those, but probably in a different situation as it's grazing of cover crops rather than permanent pasture.
Andrew, are you grazing much herbal lays as well? Because that's something that I always find is interesting, that, you know, herbal lays can have a real, you know, loads of biomass above ground, but it's actually kind of quite high and close to the soil. It can actually get quite thin. So sometimes, you know, they can take quite specific management, and it can really sort of melt away in hotter weather. Is that anything you've experienced?
No, I have tried to establish herbal or herbs into what I have a permanent pasture, and to be honest with you, it's not been that great getting it going on chalk. So that's one thing, but the cover crops I'm growing are sort of multi-species, so we will have sort of 8 to 10 species in there, and some of them are, you know, C4 grasses as well, millet, and etc. So we're trying to make it as broad as possible.
Yeah, I think definitely just coming back to that point about the herbal lays, because I know many people, particularly kind of under GS4 options, are putting in those multi-species swards. I can see David wants to come in, but just to say that they do take slightly different management from grass in terms of that hotter temperatures, and it can be harder to kind of hold animals up on them a little bit, and then you might want to be sort of buffering with hay or something as you're doing that. I'm really interested in hearing from David and Fergus about summer, you know, if you've got experience of summer hay feeding, because it can be quite different to winter hay feeding if you're using it as a method to slow animals down and to kind of buffer during that summer season. But David, do you want to come in with the point you're going to make, and then maybe we can pick up on summer hay feeding?
Yeah, just that point about herbal lays. There's a lot of excitement going around about herbal lays, and I was on one of our mentoring. I was down at Boar Place, and we walked through the fields, and I took my refractometer and my garlic press, and this was a field that had herbal lays, and it had a bit of ryegrass stitched into it, and we did a bricks test on it, and the ryegrass was way ahead of the herbal lays, and I think people tend to get carried away. These things like chicory, they're massive soil improvers, but they're not particularly good on animal performance, and I think people ought to be aware of that.
But they are supplying diversity and bringing up minerals, though, David.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. But as opposed to animal performance, you know, people get carried away. they aren't that good. I know Dan Burdett says they can be a nightmare, if they get too mature.
Yeah, totally. And I think the thing to remember is I remember chatting to a guy at Groundswell who was kind of quite early in his journey of kind of multi-species swards, and we were talking about herbal lays. And it dawned on me that he didn't realise what a lay was. And his assumption was that lay is just sort of another word for sward. And we had this conversation about, it's kind of a rest, if you like, in the arable rotation. Lays exist within an arable system. It's not something, and semi-permanent or pasture systems. And I think, it's a very interesting, we're going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I think there are concerns about, because of the policy direction around GS4 payments, which far exceeds kind of past, payments for sort of permanent pasture, that there are some risks that folk are kind of making decisions about putting in herbal lays as a kind of the be all and end all of regenerative grazing management, when actually there are definitely caveats to go along with them. And one is around animal performance potentially, one is about resilience in more challenging drought conditions and some of those weathers. Some it does really well, and it just depends on where you are in your grazing plan and how recently you grazed it and when the drought comes. But I think they're more complex and more challenging possibly than folks sometimes think. But if we can come back to that question, David, Andrew, Fergus, about feeding hay in the summer, is that something that you've had to do in the last year?
Me personally, no. Apart from odd times, the only way I feed now is when I need to. In summer, is we'll pull them off the grass and tighten them up and keep them in a sacrifice area. But last summer we got away by keeping the covers long in the spring and actually taking the covers down hard when the grass is growing, as opposed to skimming. We always build up the cover. So it seems to evolve. That's what we've got to do down here, to build the covers to get the covers there during the drought. So what we do is, last year what happened was we had plenty of grass until it rained. As soon as the raindrops fell on the ground, the hay bales came out, and we supplemented virtually right through till housing, really. So we don't tend to do it, other than we've lost cover, we're not growing enough grass, and we say, right, that's enough. We've got to keep the cover on the ground, feed them hay on a sacrifice area, even if it's only for a couple of days until the rain comes. I don't know. What do you say, Fergus? What's your opinion? Is it there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. So I tend to feed hay. Last spring was very cold and dry, wasn't it? And so I turn them out when the ground's dry. I chuck them out and feed hay just to get them out the barn if they're in the barn, and feed hay then for a short while. Then it rained, like David said, warmed up, and then it went dry. And I think the only time I use a ring feeder is when it's very, very dry and I create a corral somewhere in desperation, and that normally makes it rain, and that normally lasts about 10 days. And when it rains, then you hold back for about another couple of weeks and let it get going. But in the autumn, I do it a bit differently to David. I've fed hay during October because our drought finished mid-September. So I fed hay whilst it was growing slowly, to allow when it got really wet in November, the fibre levels to rise. And I actually fed less. I fed no hay all through November and into December. And then we had the snow. Then I poured them in and then put them back out again. So it's very important for autumn, and I think David will agree, for autumn grazing, when you get the flush, which we had a hell of a one last year, it's very important to make sure that's mature, and then you don't get the animal, you don't get the poaching.
Otherwise, you've got to balance it with fibre, which is hay or even straw.
So you're often feeding hay during periods of rapid growing, and not whilst you're consuming it until post Christmas. Then it's different. We can graze right up till Christmas and more January, beginning of January, without supplementing because the grass has got I've worked this one out now, the fibre levels are high enough. It's during the rapid growth period, and we're going to I'm in danger of it happening this year because I'm a bit short cover at the moment. I've pushed a bit too hard. So I think when the warm weather comes, I'm going to probably have to feed hay a bit longer than I was hoping to. So I've just been to the dentist today. I can hardly talk, but the point
we can't help it. You're fine. You're fine.
Oh, good. The key thing here is autumn in the southeast, where we're talking about today. In the southeast, I think the autumn we have. I mean, last year, for example, we had more grass growth, more grazing post August or post mid September through till the end of the year than we had in the spring. But to utilise that, it's got to be long, fibrous, to carry the animals, and ideally not have to supplement. Would you agree, David?
Can't hear you, David. I think your sound's doing something weird. Just while we wait for you to sort that out, David, I just want to draw attention back to that point that both Fergus and David have made, which is, yeah, Debbie said, I'm getting confused when to feed hay. So I'm just going to go through that.
Oh.
So just to clarify, what these guys are saying is that even when it starts to, so if they're slowing down their grazing, because they're thinking, right, we've got a drought ahead of us, we haven't got rain on the horizon, we haven't got enough cover ahead of us, we haven't got lots of grass ahead of us, so we're going to slow down. So they might slow down that grazing and then possibly start to feed hay if they need to, but the primary thing is to slow that grazing down, and then maybe to start feeding hay, but to continue feeding that even when it's raining. So what they're saying is, if it's raining and everyone's going, hallelujah, it's raining, we can go back to grazing, don't. Wait, be patient, let that grass get up a bit, let it do its thing, because there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that you want to let it grow, because if you hit it as soon as it's starting to grow, you're going to set it back. Secondly, it ends up being something called washy, so which is kind of, sounds like, it is what it sounds like. The grass ends up being more water than anything else, and so it's just going to run straight through those cows and come out the other end in a nice wet splat, or not very nice wet splat, and it's not actually going to do any good, and you then run various risks of staggers and all sorts of things happening. So it's important that you don't just, as soon as the rain hits, think, brilliant, I can get back to grazing. Hold off, keep feeding that supplementary hay if you need to, until that grass has had maybe a week or so, or a bit longer. It depends on what the weather's like, but let it get up and growing before you get excited and graze. Is that right, David? Can we hear you? Still can't hear you.
No, that's absolutely spot on. And down here, I mean, November and December, I reckon, are some of our best grazing times of the year, because you've got really good grass. They're not, you've held it back. And it goes back to what I was saying about in the drought and do the trampling. That is often the grass that comes out from under the trample bit and I start all that in about July time. Get the grass trampled, massive trampling effect, and forget about it, and then wait until the rain comes, and then a few weeks later go in, and that creates some. I don't know. That's what keeps the show on the road in the pre-Christmas period, really.
I'm just going to share a slide from one of the previous sessions, actually, which I think helps. So hang on, I don't think I'm sharing my screen. Bear with me a sec. Let me just share my screen. And I don't know if you remember when we talked about grazing planning, this was the slide that hopefully you can see this, it's being a bit slow. So, this is our year. So we've got, just so that you can kind of understand kind of where we are in the year. So, for example, we're about to come into this purple. We're sort of between the blue and the purple at the moment. Well, we're still firmly in the blue here, but for you guys, we're heading towards that purple. So the grass is going to get growing after the winter. We tend to skim because grazing grows grass. So we skim across quite quickly, so that we're not taking too much and what's left can grow. It depends on various other weather situations, but at that point, if you're worried about it not really getting ahead, you might want to slow down and buffer and actually slow your way through the grazing plan. And then as we get into that kind of normally wet late spring, so we're kind of here it's June, but for you it's probably May time, the grass is really pumping, it's really growing, so you want to speed up those moves so that you can graze it and then let it recover. You know, the next day it will start recovering and growing. And as we go into the later summer, we get this summer slump where the grass growth slows down, the seed heads start coming out, flowering, so we're leaving longer residuals, maybe shutting up paddocks to come back to later in the year, having that standing hay, and we might be going back to that first grazed grass that we've already been to in our rotation. And this is the point we're talking about. It's this green bit here. This summer slump can be extended because of the drought situation. So that's that point where you're kind of thinking, right, we need to, at that point, maybe hold off. We might go into some of that kind of standing hay and feed that, or we might decide that we're going to slow them right down so that when that autumn flush comes, we can maximize that, which is exactly what Fergus is talking about, and having that really nice grazing right through into the new year. So hopefully that kind of giving you that idea of what the year looks like will give this a little bit more context. There was a question from Debbie about slowing down grazing. Would you hold the animals in one area or not move them as often? And that's exactly right, Debbie. So you can either hold them in one area, which is what David was talking about, sacrifice area. So you can just hold them in a paddock and feed hay if you need to. I would really recommend, if you're going to hold animals in an area, that you don't force them to eat absolutely everything that's there, because if you're holding them there longer, you're going to increase the risk of parasite burden going up. So you just need to be a bit careful that if you are going to hold animals longer in one period, particularly if they've been used to moving, then you must be supplementing them. You need to give them more to eat. So you could either, for example, start strip grazing and you're just giving them a little bit of fresh every day, or you hold them in one area, but make sure you're supplementing their feed. Don't just think, oh, well, there's still a bit of grass here, I'm going to make them eat it and force them to, and just leave them here for a week. If they're used to moving, I think that, you know, they're probably, it's going to check them quite a bit if you change the management that drastically. Fergus, you still got your hand up. Did you want to come in again?
Yeah,
okay.
but actually, on that subject, we're so tight on grass down here. I can't stand seeing short grass. So moving them and supplementing them to control nothing annoys me more than, say, September, August, and a load of very short grass. I totally agree with what you said about what you just said, but I really do not like, even if it's 2 acres, we haven't got the land, so. You know, once you've overgrazed in August, and that's it for the, you know, when the rain comes, that's pretty much it. You know, so we do. I tend to. I try and avoid it by building up my summer sort of wedge, and 9 times out of 10 that works. Didn't in 2018, didn't last year, but in a normal year that sees us through. And then it's not an issue. It's only when you get the one in 8 years, whatever it is nowadays, really bad ones. And then, but you can't farm for 1 in 8, can you? You just have to deal with it when it comes.
Totally. David, did you want to come in there?
Sorry, I'm having problems with my internet. It keeps dropping off.
We can hear you. This is good.
Yeah, I think it was my headphones. Yeah, this business sacrifice areas, it is very difficult. Like Fergus says, we're quite short on pasture, so when we sacrifice, we've got to feed them here. They will take it down the soil. You can't stop them. But if it's a small area, it's a sacrifice. But can anyone still hear me?
Yeah, we still got you.
All right. Yeah. So you know, I take your point about parasites. But what we find is we don't have to do it for a long, extended period of time. But just feed them here on the ground. That's the best way around for us. But like Fergus says, we're so short of acres, and there's so many animals. You've got to be so proactive. You've got to be thinking 3 weeks ahead, 4 weeks ahead. And if the grass isn't growing for that 4-week period ahead, you've got to react now and not wait till, oh shit, we haven't got any grass left. It's just, you know, you're on the back foot then.
Totally. I think, Absolutely agree. And I think the important thing is to be doing that thinking and doing that planning. I mean, we very much take the same approach that Fergus talked about, which is building up massive covers into the summer and just having as much grass as we possibly can ahead of us. And the thing is, if you're grazing that and you're not taking it down hard, you can just come back to it a bit later, because it will bounce back, particularly in the autumn. You'll get that flush through, and then we'll be grazing that right through into the new year. And if we would always manage it so that we could, if we needed to, only graze standing hay and not require any kind of conserved forage, but the snow puts the kibosh on that for us. Andrew, is there anything else from all these things that we're talking about, anything that you want to bring in there?
Well, I suppose to a degree, I'm quite lucky, because what we tend to do in the summer, if we've got a dry summer up on the chalk escarpments or whatever else, we just retreat to the marshes, and it's as simple as that. It does take a bit of organising, but it is, and it's not the best grazing, but it does. We do see quite a flush and a response to rotational grazing there.
I think the most important thing for me is that we're all looking at the weather long term. Don't rely on like the bog standard weather app that you get on your phone. There's loads out there that give you a longer range, and I think those are the things that you need to be looking at. And you can become obsessive, but just it's not a bad thing to be obsessive about, is looking at that longer range weather, even if it's just to give an indication, because we know that it's not necessarily always going to be spot on, but at least you can think, right, it looks like it's going to be hot and dry for a month. I need to think about, what have I got here that I can feed for that month? And if it then gets worse after that, or it continues, what am I going to do? So always thinking ahead, not just kind of, reacting last minute, but, that planning, even if it's not on paper, is so important, so that that you've got contingencies. And it sounds like what Andrew was saying, the contingency for them is, retreat to the marshes. So, right, what contingencies can you put in place? Have you got a paddock that you can think, right, I can just stick them in there and I can chuck some hay in, and that's where we can stay. We can wait it out in there for a month if we really needed to. And have I got a good water supply? Because that's the other thing, if you've got decent water. Or could you think, well, actually I've probably my stocking rate is that I could carry on maybe slowing them down a little bit, but I can just instead of giving half an acre a day, I'm giving 3/4 of an acre, just to slow down enough so that you can maintain those swards ahead, the covers ahead of you. So I think it's just about being a little bit adaptive as you're going into those more tricky weather situations.
And I think the other thing is knowing what your own microclimate is, to be honest as well. It's okay. Folks don't know exactly where I am here, but there's the A2 runs from London to Dover, sort of just east of here, and it's a well-known fact that it rains this side or on the west side of the A2, but invariably the A2 is a dividing line, and to the east of it, invariably, they don't get rain out there. And so I think it's pretty crucial knowing what goes on in your own local microclimate as well.
That's, I think, a really, really good point. Sorry, David.
So it's the motorway tarmac causing the heat shield.
Yeah, quite probably.
You're right. I think the other thing that we haven't talked about, because we've talked very much about grass, and obviously this is a soil-focused set of webinars, but animal welfare and animal health has to kind of trump everything else. We need to make sure that we're not putting our animals in a situation where they're at risk of heat stress. So if it is hot and it's prolonged periods of hot weather, it's really important to make sure that they can either get some shade, or actually what we find, particularly with the cattle, I can't speak for sheep, but I assume it's similar. Actually, a breeze is something that they will choose over shade. So when we had really, really hot weather in the summer, I was, taking down some electric fences they could get to shade. They didn't care about getting in the shade, and I would always find them at the same point at the hottest part of the day, and it was where there was a bit of a breeze coming through. So it's important to remember as well that there are different things that help to keep animals cool. Might be shade, might be a breeze, it might be a slightly wetter patch on that ground and it's just slightly cooler. So there are other things than shade that might be useful to the animals as well, if you really are kind of getting into a panic about what what you're going to be able to do for the animal's best interest.
Well, yeah, last summer we did have some sheep, some finishing store lambs down on the marsh, and it was fairly open. And I just took a couple of bale trailers out there actually, and they just all got under them, and they worked pretty well.
Yeah, I think anything to give that bit of shade and just that bit of protection can really, really help.
Nikki,
shall we have some questions?
Yeah, Nikki, I was just going to ask you actually, or just as a comment, but also what you were saying about thinking ahead and drought. Down here, we've had a lot of flooding as well. And so when we were talking with Russ, he was saying how important it was for him to save some of the ground higher ground he has, because he knew that he could then use that when the floods came. Because it's so unpredictable now.
Yeah, you're right. It's just getting so unpredictable. And, particularly if a lot of people around you during the drought are creating that capped soil, they're hammering it hard. And then, it can be, you can do whatever you can on your farm, but actually, nature doesn't stick to our boundaries, does it? So if you've got farms around you that are managing in a different way, that means that the hell of a lot of runoff is going to come off onto your ground, and then you've suddenly got all of this water and you need to get animals to high ground, then yeah, again, it's that thing of having those contingencies. And for me, that's why I really like having that grazing plan, because at this time of the year I can see the whole year ahead of me. Maybe it's just because I like being able to see things, but I can almost kind of physically move that. So it's like, right, if we didn't get any rain at this point, what would I need to do and what could I tweak to make sure that we're still going to be okay at that point in the year? Or, if we had this sort of weather, where can I make sure the animals can get to? So having that planning, even if it's rough on a bit of paper, and just being able to move those things around, I think can really help. Should we just pause and see if there's any questions at all?
I've got another question while people are thinking, if that's okay.
Cool.
I just wondered if you could talk about the value of feeding standing hay, which is a term you used, versus cutting hay to feed. This came up a bit today when we were at David's on an event.
Sure, yeah. So from my point of view, there's a significant cost reduction. You don't have to have any vehicles or machinery to cut the hay. You haven't got to try and fit in with contractors. So, leaving grass standing and using it, you might hear the term standing hay, deferred grazing, or foggage is the old English word for it. But any of those three terms basically is describing the same thing, which is grass that has been shut up in the summer. So when I say shut up, you basically shut the gate on that field, or you put electric fencing up so the animals can't graze it, and you don't come back to it until later in the year. And yeah, the benefits, definitely, I guess there are three key benefits for me. One is the cost saving and the fossil fuel saving that I've just mentioned, in terms of not having to get kit out. Particularly if it's inaccessible or it's somewhere a bit tricky or a bit awkward, then you're not having to worry about that. You can just shut those paddocks up and come back to them. The other benefit is that it often gives the animal a really nice mixed bite. So this is something I've talked about before. So remember, if it's green, it's protein, and if it's a bit browner, it's fibre. And we want animals to have a nice balance of protein and fibre as they're in their digestive system, in the rumen, because that means that they've got something to, particularly with the fibre, it just holds the protein in the rumen a bit longer, and it means that they can actually get more out of it. If they just eat very fresh green grass, it goes straight through them. So if they've got that mixed bite, actually the kind of drier stuff holds that green stuff in the rumen, and it means the animal can get as much positive kind of protein out of it as they can. So we want that mixed bite because it also will just ensure that they are, as I said, that they've got that good digestive system, but also you're not then putting any kind of challenge on them in terms of their immune system being challenged because they're having to cope with a suboptimal dietary condition. So you want to make sure that, doing those dung scoring, going out and looking at those pats, seeing those nice round pats with the dip in the middle and a slick, or with your sheep, sort of seeing those, you don't want anything too pellety, you don't want anything too soft, kind of held together. I don't know what to call a sheep poo, a kind of sausage sheep poo, rather than anything too pellety or too wet. So that quite often that mixed bite that they get is what gives them that really good dung. And then I think the third thing is that there's a real misunderstanding about the quality of standing hay. And it was fascinating. I had a consultant here who came for a pre-visit scoffing about the poor quality of the grass in our field because it was standing hay, and she made some comment about all this, this kind of crappy grass at this time of the year. And interestingly, I actually got it analysed, and the protein was really high, the ME was really good, the dry matter was good. So actually, I think we're quite often told by more conventional systems that you have to spend money to produce something that's better than what's naturally there. But actually, if you start going and testing this stuff, it is pretty good. And it does do the job that you need it to. And if we've got animals going into winter fat, then you only need that maintenance ration over the winter, and you're going to be able to give them everything that they need from that standing hay. I guess a caveat would be there are some folk who let the standing hay, there's a risk of over resting. And so you want the mixed bite to be a mixed bite. You don't want it, just as you don't want everything to be really fresh and lush all the time, you also don't want everything to be really dry and stalky. And that is inevitably going to happen, either through drought or through, over resting sometimes. But, you've got to also kind of be a bit careful. So I was on a farm recently, they rest for something like 15 months. And at the point they're feeding it, like now, it's actually just a bit too fibrous. And also if it then gets a rain hit, it becomes a bit slimy. So that definitely can happen. And if you get heavy snow or a lot of rain, the standing hay can take a bit of a hit if it's left too fibrous. If you have still got some green in there, it can kind of, a good mix, it can stand up to more extreme winter weather. David, do you want to contribute there?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I was just going to reiterate what you said, Nikki. I mean, standing here, down here, once it gets to January, end of January, some of the softer leaves have gone down and they're starting to rot. And it seems to me that the standing here or this deferred grazing come end of January, if it comes really wet, then a lot of it is gone, basically what you said, really.
Sorry, was there a question that just came up? How does the standing hay impact the soil compared to cutting? Well, obviously you're not going to have the issue that you have when you cut hay is you're obviously driving over it, so there's a compaction risk. The other thing that happens quite often, unless you get a really nice not a nice contractor, but a contractor who's willing to lift the mower a little bit, quite often it gets absolutely scalped. So hay conventionally cut is taken right down to the ground, and obviously we know from the pictures I was showing this evening that if you cut it right down to the ground, you're suddenly going to have opening up the risk of that ground baking, of it getting really hot, and then there is what's left not being able to recover sufficiently enough for a graze again later that year. So yeah, one of the real downsides of a hay cut is that what's left can really take a hammering and struggles to recover. Dave, do you want to come in?
Sorry.
No, it's great.
Yeah. There is the point, the grass cutter doesn't affect the microbes like a cow ripping at the plant. The cow, when she puts her tongue around the plant, she rips that plant and it sends a shock wave, according to these soil experts like Alan Williams, it sends a shock wave down to the roots. And it stimulates the microbes in the rhizosphere in the roots to make that, and it obviously must stimulate the plant to produce more exudates to fire up the microbes. Whereas a disc mower doesn't know; they don't know what's happened. The plant doesn't know what's happened to it.
True. There are some suggestions that the smell of cut grass that you get is a particular chemical release that is a warning signal, and it puts the grass in a stressed situation. Actually, Pen's not here. Pen knows all about this. She'd be brilliant at giving us that answer. We've got a question from Paul. David suggested earlier today we regeneratively graze our land, and I think that's buy-in hay. Not butt-in hay, buy-in hay.
Yeah.
This sounded like a great idea to me. Yeah, and we talked about this, I think, the other week, didn't we? About your choices to buy in hay rather than making hay.
Yeah. Three things, really. Sorry, can everyone hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Three things, really. Buying in hay, as opposed to making your hay, the grass that you would have made on your farm into hay, putting it through your cows is worth more to your cow than it would be if you made it into hay. Right? Is it? Yeah. And also,
say that again.
Buying hay.
Say that again, David, just so it's really clear for everyone.
The grass that you would have made, your own grass that you would have made into hay, if you, as opposed to making it into hay or silage or conserving it, whatever way you would do it, if you put it through the cow as grass, you get more goodness out of it. So you get more live weight gain, you get more milk. You know, grass on the ground is worth more than the best conserved forage. So if you're then buying that hay to replace what you would have made, you get your hay back, but you're also, if you're feeding it out on the field as a supplement, you're feeding the microbes. So you're concentrating more and more fertility on your own land. Does that make sense? So in my eyes and Fergus's eyes, we were talking about this 4 or 5 o'clock. It's a 3-way gain.
Yeah, totally. It makes
Plus
more sense to buy in carbon. Yeah.
You're buying in more carbon, yeah.
Fergus, do you want to come in?
It's a really hard concept, and I would strongly recommend Greg Judy does a whole chapter on that. And you buy a bale of hay for 25 quid. I just bought some. I go around scouting around, buy a bale of hay for 25 quid. It's not costing you that, because that 25 quid bale of hay, I'm feeding it whenever I feed it. If I made it on my own farm, I've had that grass, haven't I? So that comes down 50%. So I've got double the amount of feed for the same money. And if you feed that, if you get that long grass like I described earlier, in the not made into hay, the biggest way of going wrong in the southeast of England is shut up too much land, because once you get a drought, you're in trouble. So buy your hay, feed standing hay in the summer, and that will then in turn create your autumn grazing. And that hay is at 20. I mean, people down here think I'm mad, but you're getting it twice and possibly 3 times off the same. That 25 quid's going 3 ways rather than one.
Yeah. So Fergus, just to clarify, you said about, you don't want to shut up too many paddocks, and so you're saying don't shut them up to make hay, but you can shut them up to graze them potentially. Just to clarify what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, I sent you a slide, didn't I, the other week of grazing grass. Yeah, and that is what I like, and that gets us through second half of July and into August, and that is the point when if you really want to, and it's the only time I do multiple moves a day. I mean, it's only for, it's a real. I did try and explain, but you've got to try and graze in an ideal world, they graze the high devalue material, i.e. the leafy. They trample the stalky stuff, and there's a bit of protein in there to help the digestion. And then that is the most skillful time for me, or the way I do it, in the year. And you've got to be right on it, because to maintain body condition, growth rates, intakes, everything else, and it's multiple moves. But why make all that hay down here? I mean, David's got a neighbour. He won't tell you this. David's got a neighbour who makes hay. He'll be making and feeding hay adjacent to David's farm all summer. Bonkers.
So I'm just going to interrupt there, Fergus, because I don't you sent me just to hand, but some photos, the left and right photos on this image. So this is midsummer grazing. I'll just make that so you can see it. So this is pretty similar to what, maybe you've got fewer buttercups in this paddock, but it's that kind of, that trampling that you're getting. Can you see that, Fergus, or not?
I can see one with the buttercups in the water trough very nicely positioned, yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that level of grass growth and trampling that you're seeing either side of the fence is kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, it's varying degrees of that. But I mean, that is. And is that on your farm?
Yeah, this was some rented grazing that we took for just it was a seasonal let.
Yeah, so we've got more of this, sort of clover and perennial and what have you. But
Yeah.
the same principle applies. Down here, people will be haying all that and feeding it. It's very, very normal to see people feeding hay in August down here.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that there was a photo that people could understand when you're talking about that taller covers. Like, this is the sort of length that we're talking about, where some of it might have gone to seed a bit, but some of it hasn't, and there's plenty of green, but there's also the stemmy stuff. So the left and right photos there, don't be afraid if it's getting up like that. I'll just stop the share.
I've just seen the right hand one. That right hand one's absolutely spot on. That's exactly it. Yeah, perfect. I'm on an iPhone again. Yeah, so that's what you need. Yeah. That's great.
Awesome. Okay. Right. Any questions? Any other questions that are coming in? Deborah's asked loads of questions. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is that if you want to go beyond buying in hay and you want to not buy any hay, and you really are not interested in buying in hay and you want to defer all your grazing, recommend a book by a guy called Jim Gerrish called Kicking the Hay Habit. And even if that doesn't convince you to completely go for deferred grazing entirely, it's got some really good concepts in it that are worth reading and thinking about. I think, Jim Gerrish is pretty sound on where he stands with that.
Really good.
Yeah. And I guess the other two things to think about as well, the Clifton Park farm system, which is like 18 something. There's a brilliant passage in that book that's about the mixed bite, and that this ideal bite, particularly kind of into the spring, where you're coming in to graze something that's got a bit of new growth, and the older grass behind that's been left is like the ideal, the perfect bite. So that's probably worth having a read of as well. So yeah, just in terms of a couple, and also oh God, what's his name? The French guy. Completely lost his name. Thank you. I've got one of those moments. Yeah, so Voisin's work is and based in England, based in Scotland, but takes a UK approach, because a lot of this stuff comes from the US. So it's worth having a read of that as well, if you're interested. Any other questions? Or anything, Andrew, that you want to add? Sorry, David, Fergus and I have been yammering on here. Is there anything you'd like to contribute as well?
No. You guys are pretty much into more into sort of permanent type pastures. Mine's just sort of out there on, I put more weight on during the winter on cover crops than I do during the summer, to be honest.
Yeah.
And it's just how the system works. And I suppose I'm growing in terms of cash crops. I'm growing quite a lot of sort of more late sown cash crops, which then extends my cover crop grazing period over the winter. So I'm growing millet that quite often doesn't get drilled until sort of end of May, and linseed possibly into April. So I'm extending my cover crop grazing because I'm getting more livestock growth on that than I am on some poor permanent pasture.
Yeah. Nice, that's really great to hear. And that just reminded me, actually, I just made a note for myself to talk about destocking. And I think that this is something that we don't do enough of in the UK. And actually, look to New Zealand, look to Australia for the way that they destock when actually the weather's not great. And I was chatting to a guy the other day who didn't really get his animals right going into winter. So they've been cattle and sheep. Primarily the cattle he's concerned about. They've been held out on the hill over the winter. They've lost a lot of weight. He's paying a lot of money to feed them, to get that hay in, to try and get some condition back on them, because he is concerned about that. And I was like, is it worth it? Like, you've got to undertake that cost benefit analysis. You need to do the numbers. Is it worth him buying in even more hay to try and get some condition on these animals? For what? Is he going to sell them down the line? Can you sell them earlier? Can you get rid of them? At the moment, he's not in a good situation because of the weather and the combination of the weather that we've had here and his, not getting his animals right before winter, but making the most of the cull cow price, for example, at the moment, and actually getting rid of those animals. And I think particularly when we're thinking about drought, I'm a strong believer that there's no such thing as too many animals too little land, it's always too many animals. You know, the land that you've got is the land that you've got, essentially, whether it's, you know, all owned or part rented or whatever. For the grazing season or for that year, that land that you've got is the land that you've got. And so managing to that, rather than saying, oh, I've not got enough land, I need to buy in all this additional feed, you know, does it make financial sense? It might not, but you need to do the sums. And if it doesn't make sense, get rid of some animals, because the worst thing is just holding on to animals and then making a loss because you paid to feed them and then not got any additional value. You know, you've not necessarily got them heavier because you're in a drought situation or you're in bad weather and they're not thriving. So it's so important that we all understand, that we really all understand the cost of production, and that even if we're making a loss, that we understand that, or, you know, what we're doing to, you know, making decisions that are based on the finances plus the best thing for the animals plus the, you know, the weather conditions, and don't just kind of keep on keeping on for the sake of it, complaining about the weather.
You just need to be opportunistic, don't you?
Yeah,
in my opinion.
Simon's asked about the conservation or biodiversity value to haymaking, or are we thinking this may be a myth too? I mean, the idea is that you kind of cut and remove, and, you know, hay meadows originated because people would be then keeping animals inside close to steadings historically. Let's remember that most cattle, for example, you know, they were house cows, they were kept for milking, or we had animals that we used for draft. So historically, thinking right back when we were all kind of subsistence farming in feudal systems, it made sense to have hay meadows that were cut and then hay was conserved so that you could have it close to the steading, because you only got people power, you know, it's easier to manage in that way. And those animals were much more closely linked to the homestead. So I think that you know, historic management of hay meadows for cutting and then feeding as conserved forage is part of a kind of rural tradition. And I think that, yeah, the lack of research really that has gone into understanding the biological, what's happening biologically in the soil and what's happening around mineral availability, or what's happening around what's enabling species richness, with the caveat that there are obviously particularly calcareous grasslands where the delicate tiny flowers do need that removal to happen, but that can be achieved with a graze. It just has to be at the right time and you know, and managed very carefully. I think that, yeah, the idea of like removing hay, I mean, it just doesn't happen in nature. It doesn't happen anywhere in nature, kind of in natural processes. It's always animals that are eating that grass or that pasture where it is, and then moving on. So I think, I'm not saying it's wrong, but I think there's space to question it. And I think what's brilliant is that lots of farmers are testing these things and they're assessing it and they're trying it out and they're seeing what's happening and recording it and recording their observations, and we're all kind of learning collectively. And I think, yeah, if you are deciding that cutting hay is what you want to do, then do it. You know, don't sort of think, oh, in that webinar they told me not to cut hay. If that's right for your context in your system, crack on, but don't feel you have to. If you've got, you know, kind of boring ryegrass pastures, you know, it's as David and Ferguson said, it's worth more grazed than it is cut, for sure. You'll probably get more grazes out of it, and you'll get the hay that you've bought in, as opposed to the maybe one cut and one graze. And Deborah, you've just said about you're setting up a webinar or an event, with Ian, who is a meadow expert.
It's a bit muddly, but yeah. So Ian Parkinson, who developed the flower meadows at Wakehurst, he's actually going to be running an event in the summer at Wakehurst, talking about how you can manage traditional hay meadows with grazing, and that's what they would suggest over and above cutting. So anyway, that'll be something later in the year.
That's brilliant, Deborah. And there's also I gave a caveat about calcareous grasslands, but also floodplain meadows are quite different as well. And there's some brilliant resources from the floodplain meadows team. I don't know if that affects any of you, but that's just something to take into account. You know, that not all meadows are made equal, as it were. I'm conscious that we've just got 5 minutes left. We've talked a lot about kind of dealing with extremes. Is there anything else around extremes, or anything else we've covered over the 5 webinars that anyone has questions about, or anything else they want to ask? Or everyone's staying nice and, well, not nice and quiet, everyone's staying very quiet this evening. We haven't got Tim, have we? Tim normally has a question. Oh, you're on mute, Deborah.
I say he sends apologies. He couldn't make it because of the change of date.
Has he sent a question? That would have been good.
Sadly not.
Anyone else?
Just as I haven't been on. I've just come in as a bit of a tail end Charlie, to be honest. But just as offered a bit of a tangent. What are people using for mineral supplementation? Just as an interest.
We don't. Other than the first time ever was this autumn, we had an instance of grass staggers in a contract grazing agreement cow that we had here. It wasn't ours, and it was just really washy grass, and we were taking on. Yeah, we've taken on grazing grass that has been previously overgrazed, and I just think that the sward isn't ready to kind of. It hasn't recovered from decades of being absolutely hammered. So. For us, at that point we gave a yellow Rockies block, and that was just because I was really nervous about magnesium levels. But David,
yes, really, I don't use any now. I mean, 10 years ago, I had the magnesium bottles and the calcium bottles right by the cow she calved, and quite often I'd have to inject them straight in the vein straight away. I don't buy any now. Not even dry cows really. And I think I put it down to the grass being stronger, the roots going deeper and bringing up whatever the cow needs,
I would say, David, are you blood testing?
No.
Okay.
No. Possibly I should, but I'm not getting any problems. Like I'm not getting metabolic problems anymore. It's just sort of happened.
And you've got that observation, haven't you, where you're moving them frequently, you're seeing them frequently.
Exactly,
and you can pick those problems up early. I mean, we blood test because we're kind of pretty strong not using minerals other than in absolute like emergency, like I felt it was in the autumn. So we blood test every year. We had low iodine, and we brought in some species rich hay to help us to spread seed this year, and it's really high in iodine. So we got all the forage sampling done, forage analysis done. And that was really interesting to see that this bought-in hay was very high in iodine. So it'll be interesting when we blood test again to see if that's made the difference.
Yeah. I mean, back in the day when I was milking cows, I remember one instance I was milking, and I had 3 cows went down with staggers in the milking parlour.
Oh God!
3 cows. Well, yeah, it was just. But the ground was so degraded, the crops were all fertilised. Yeah, and that's all got fallen away now. Yeah.
And Paul's asked you, have you only stopped having problems since you stopped milking?
No, I had problems with sucker cows 10 years ago when I started. I had thin cows. I was pushing the ground. I was pushing the animals to improve the ground, possibly a bit too hard. And I had thin cows, and I had to be on them. I think I did actually lose a cow with staggers one day when she calved. Yeah, but as I've gone down this road, the necessity to use minerals has fallen away. Obviously, I'm not like Andrew. Andrew's on the downs, which are probably a lot more problematic than our heavy wheel ground.
Yeah, when we were calving, we used to have hypermagnesia problems. Yeah, same. But I always use seaweed kelp as free access. And I sort of alternate that with diatomaceous earth, and I'm putting brewed EM in brewed microbes EM in the water, a litre in livestock water once a week. It's not only just topping the livestock up; it's also that will ultimately end up in the soil. So
that's a good point.
Yeah, that's something I do, and I suppose I'm just interested to ask. Well, my opinion is that livestock will self-medicate, and if they stop taking the seaweed kelp, I tend to stop that, and then I'll put in some diatomaceous earth for a week or two. And when they stop taking that, I'll be back to the seaweed kelp, but they always get EM as well.
Yeah, I guess there's two things to add to that. One is that if you've got silver pasture or you've got good hedgerows, then you'll see the same thing there, won't you? They'll kind of sometimes you move them into a new pasture, and if they've not had access to scrub and trees for a bit, they'll just go straight to the hedge or straight to the trees.
Okay, now tell me,
absolutely.
What is ivy an indicator for?
Well, ivy is generally just an all-round good health one. So yeah, it can generally just be an all-round kind of tonic, if you like. So general immune boosting.
Right. Okay. We always see if we've got a hedgerow there and we're grazing a cover crop with a hedgerow and it's got ivy in it, they're always onto the ivy.
Yeah.
Always.
It's like a general all-round good health boost. The other thing that we put in our water fairly often is apple cider vinegar, but it has to be with mother. So it's the live version. Used to be able to buy it from Asphal's direct, and they've stopped selling direct. But we've got someone locally now who makes it for us, which is great. But yeah, we particularly use that if the animals are on a hay-only diet. And this might be something to think of if you're having to buffer with hay, is that ACV in the water, just a good old glug, can really help with the digestion. So we tend to find that if I'm doing my dung scoring and we've got really hard, like horse poo like dung, then chuck some ACV in and it softens up quite quickly. So it just helps them better to cope with that high fiber diet. We're at 8:45, so we should probably stop. But it's been a real joy to spend 5 weeks with you, even though we had a gap week, kind of delivering these sessions. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been great, David and Fergus. Is Fergus still here? Yes. To have your input all the way along. It's been, I really enjoyed having the chat.